Let's talk to Miles Templeton now, who runs boxinghistory.org.uk. Good afternoon to you, Miles.
Good afternoon, Robert.
Right then, I always think of boxing as one of the great London sports, because London has certainly produced more than its fair share of great pugilists over the years, hasn't it?
It certainly has. I agree. I totally endorse what you're saying. It's boxing, one could argue, was born in London.
Yeah.
The old prize ring, the days of the prize ring, they had a set of rules which were known as the London Prize Ring Rules.
Oh, really? Is that before Marquess of Queensberry?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was in the day when, prior to the London Prize Ring rules, you could more or less do anything in a boxing ring.
Yeah.
You could knee them, headbutt them, wrap them round the ropes and start banging the back of their head, with bare fists. But it was the London Prize Ring rules that tried to establish some sort of order to the sport.
And when would that have been? When would those have come about?
Mid-19th century when they established these rules. That's right. They were superseded by the Marquess, the Queensberry rules in the 1860s, and that's really when 3-minute rounds came in, referees, gloves, all that sort of stuff.
Has boxing always been a sport of the working classes, if you like? It had very kind of aristocratic kind of inspirers, didn't it? And
certainly did. In the old days, it was followed by what was known as the fancy.
Yeah.
Gentlemen who liked to bet. They're quite happy, on the sporting field, coursing, horse racing, cockfighting, anything where, you had a bit of a contest going on and there was
you could lay a wager.
Exactly, and boxers were really an extension of that. If you go back to the 18th century, the sport was literally watched by kings of England. They were very, very excited about it. And that really followed right the way through. Edward VII was a big boxing fan. He used to go to fights incognito, which means that, he'd sort of say, I'm coming to see this fight Thursday night. I'm not there officially. I don't want anybody to bother me, but I want to watch the boxing. Edward VIII, the one who abdicated, was the same. He was a big boxing fan and used to go to see shows regularly in London in the 1920s.
Who were the big first sort of stars of boxing, if you like, in a British context?
Well, if you go into the glove period, and you're talking about...
let's start from the period of gloves and Queensberry rules and all of that.
Okay. If you're going back to the early days, 1890s, really, once gloves became the norm.
Yeah.
You had guys long forgotten, no one's ever heard of them now. Toff Wall of Hackney, Ted Pritchard of Lambeth, Bob Habijam, Tom Causer of Bermondsey. They used to fight in pubs. Right. The Lamb and Flag in Covent Garden. I was
going to say, where were the venues in those days?
In those days, really, once it got out of field, once it got out of the open air, which of course you had to do in those days because it was against the law. It was illegal to have a prize fight. So they used to put these matches on in fields connected where 3 counties met. So that if the police
could do a runner in the other one.
You could hop over the border somewhere else and resume the fight 50 metres away where the police had no real jurisdiction.
So after those days, once it gets codified and it comes indoors, where in London would have been the big venue?
Well, originally pubs. I mean, there were no big venues. It wasn't a sport that brought in the masses. That came later, and really that came in the 20s when the sport became much more commercialised. But really pubs, places like the Windsor Castle in Plumstead, the Blue Anchor in Shoreditch, the Hop and Malt Exchange in Borough, Kennington Social Club, the Grafton Hall in Soho, Lambeth School of Arms. The first real club in London, which was populated by aristocrats and bohemians, was known as the Pelican Club. It only ran for about 5 years, from the late 1880s.
Where was that?
It was in the centre of London, right smack bang in the middle of London. And, it was really an excuse to bet. You had the middle classes, the upper classes with a bit of money. It brought the classes together. Your sort of Regency period brought in royalty and dukes and earls, people like Lord Lonsdale, Marquess of Queensberry, etc. Your middle class, nouveau rich came in wanting to bet and gamble. And then, of course, the working class lads would be the guys in the ring, the trainers, the seconds, the people who really were the bedrock of the sport. Brought them all together. And there was a great sense of respect to boxers from, if you like, people that they would know of as being the toffs.
Moving into the 20th century,
when's
a sort of a golden age, if you like, of British boxing?
There's been a number of golden ages. The first one was really the Edwardian period, when boxing really boomed.
Yeah.
At that time, you had your football. There was a bit of an interest, obviously, there's always been an interest in horse racing and athletics. Cycling was popular, but really, the sports that we think of today just didn't exist. And boxing was probably the second or third most popular sport in the country. Now, it was run in London in the days before any sort of control was established by a club called the National Sporting Club.
Yeah.
The building is still there in Covent Garden, 43 King Street. I think it's a shoe shop now. Basically, it was a betting establishment, pure and simple. But they had a reputation there for organising and running fair fights, which meant people were quite happy to bet, knowing that the fight was on the level. And the big fights were supported by backers, influential, wealthy middle-class people who put up large side stakes. They might have £500 riding on the outcome of the bout. £500 a side, £1,000 in the pot, winner gets the lot.
Wow.
It's not the winner that gets it. The boxer might have earned £10 or £20. It was the backers who made the money. So they'd bring a boxer in, they'd look after him, they'd train him, they'd feed him well, they'd make sure he was as fit as could be, and they really spoilt him. Of course, until he was past his best, when in the good old tradition of boxing they were more or less thrown on the scrap heap. But whilst they were there in their prime, these men got behind them and made money off them in the same way you would out of a greyhound, a whippet, a horse, or something like that.
I've been reading a novel recently set in London, which has just been reissued. I'm struggling to remember what it was called, but set in London in the sort of 30s, and it's about a kid from Notting Hill, actually, or Notting Dale, as it said in the book, who's going, he's coming up as an up and coming young fighter. And in this, there's fights pretty much every night. So there's fights in Camden, there's fights in Islington,
There was fights in London. You could see professional boxing every day of the week, probably twice a day if you wanted to.
Wow.
The Great Hall, and I will pay due respect to York Hall at Bethnal Green, that's the modern-day version of these old stadia. But back in the 20s, the real top venue in London, and I would argue London's greatest small hall, was the Blackfriars Ring.
Right.
There's a pub there now called the Ring Blackfriars, good boozer, lots of boxing pictures on the wall. Across the road from that, a massive great glass tower block which stands on the site of what was an octagonal church built in the 1770s. It was octagonal because it was a religious establishment and they didn't want anywhere for the devil to hide. It then became a warehouse. It was picked up in 1910 by a very famous old boxer called Dick Burge, who'd just come out of jail for 8 years for a fraud case, and he was looking to re-establish himself. He saw this building and he turned it into London's greatest small hall, the Ring Blackfriars. And there was boxing there Sunday afternoon, Monday evening, Thursday evening, twice on a Saturday, and so on. 5 or 6 shows a week at just that one venue. But that was one of many in London in the 20s and the 30s, particularly, where you could, if you like boxing, you were absolutely. You couldn't get in.
Spoiled for choice.
Absolutely. That's right.
When did boxing become a big international affair? So you'd have the British fighters fighting the best American fighters or whatever.
Okay. Well, America really got into boxing in the first decade of the 20th century. It really started to come to the forefront. There was huge rivalry between what was considered to be the British school, or more accurately, the English school, straight left. Pretty boxing, avoiding being hit, and the rough, tough, aggressive, tear-away American style. And eventually the American style predominated. Brits had to really fight like that to get anywhere. The French got involved about 1905-6. And they really, a lot of boxing in Paris took off, largely because Brits went over there and established the sport and boxed Frenchmen. But after a period of time, the Frenchmen started to hold their own. And most particularly, the very famous boxer of that period from France, Georges Carpentier, who was a sort of a David Beckham of his time. He was a matinee idol, incredibly good-looking. He came over and beat all the Brits we could put up in front of him, usually pretty quickly and often in controversial circumstances, but a very, very popular man. And by about 1920, the sport's getting established throughout Europe. It wasn't until really the 50s and 60s that places like the Philippines, Japan, South America, and so on, they got involved as well. And another big centre in the Edwardian period was Australia. A lot of English and British fighters went out there and made a lot of money in places like Sydney and Melbourne.
What about when I'm old enough to just about remember kind of when every other pub on the Old Kent Road seemed to have a boxing gym above it, or you'd get box.
Thomas and Beckett was the one.
Thomas Beckett was the most famous of them, certainly.
Of them, though.
And there were lots, even North London, Islington had a few. Right. I mean, it was very much a kind of an inner London working class sport then, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Well, South London and East London were terrific rivals in the boxing ring, particularly if you go back to the 20s. The East End was primarily Jewish.
Yeah. And they were great Jewish boxers, weren't they?
They really were. Ted Kid Lewis, Jack Kidberger, the two outstanding ones. Names that although largely forgotten today, some of your listeners will know those names. And they were arguably, for my money, two of the best British fighters from the whole period before the war, both of whom came from within half a mile of each other in Whitechapel.
And when did we start to see the black British boxers coming through?
Well, 5 of them came over, funnily enough, on the first boat that came over in 1948.
Really?
Absolutely. I've got a great...
What, on the Windrush?
On the Windrush, yeah. I've got a great photograph of them climbing down the stairs with a trainer posing for the press. So 5 came in on the Windrush, at least 5. I think there was another one as well. By about 9, but there again, a lot of black fighters had been over here before that. You know, they were coming in anyway because this was where you made money, particularly if you were from what we used to refer to as the colonies. And a lot of black fighters came over from all over Jamaica, Nigeria, Ghana, or then known as the Gold Coast. But by the 50s, really, they were well established and well liked by the fight fans.
Where are we now, would you say, in boxing? It certainly seemed to go through a very fallow period, perhaps.
It did.
I mean, we're talking a book about later about the Eubank Ben Watson era, and it describes that as the last golden era of British boxing. Would you have that? Well,
not really. I think today's... The problem with the sport today is it's not seen by enough people.
Yeah. You know, it used to be prime-time telly, didn't it, for example?
I mean, in the days of Minter and John Conte and Johnny Stracey and people like that, you know, you might have 10 or 15 million people watching it. On ITV and BBC, Jim Watt, people like that, you know, it was a mass sport then. But it's been taken over really by channels where there's a hugely dedicated following, but your average viewer is just simply not going to come across it.
And it's pay-per-view, isn't it?
That's right, it is, yeah.
It's become specialist.
It's killed it. But there again, it's quite a golden era now. We've got some terrific fighters these days, and the game is booming at the moment. There's a lot of pros around.
Also, the game's strong. I was going to say, when did that amateur-professional divide really occur?
Well, the amateur-professional... Well, if you go back to the Edwardian period, I mean, there's a lot of good amateurs who simply never would have dreamt of turning professional. Yeah. I mean, there's a classic amateur... And I don't know if many of your viewers would be aware of this, but he won an Olympic gold medal for boxing and was captain of the England cricket team.
Wow.
Now, that's amateur.
Yeah.
His name was J.W.H.T. Douglas. And on the cricket ground, he was known... Because he never really scored that many runs quickly. He was always known as Johnny Won't Hit Today.
Unfortunately, we've only got a minute left.
Okay, right.
So, Miles, you say that we're in a good period now?
I think so. But not like it was. Not like it was.
It will probably never be the mass sport again that it was, will it?
No, I think football is probably the number one sport in the country, followed closely by football, and then in third place is probably football.
And everyone else is scrabbling for all the other stuff. That's the way it is
now, of course. And there's so much choice now, skateboarding and you know, also kids can do so many other things.
But there is still room, isn't there, for the dedication, for the commitment, for the discipline of boxing.
Yeah. What you said earlier was bang on. They used to say boxers, nobody trained like them, nobody was as fit as them, and I think that is true. And one must never forget just how the proud traditions of amateur boxing in London, particularly in the 50s and 60s, and there were 250 clubs in London just after the war, probably with an average of 40 or 50. There's probably 10 or 12,000 active amateurs in London just after the war, and probably 1,000 pros.
Miles, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, sir.
Pleasure.
Miles Templeton, who runs boxinghistory.org.uk. What a great bloke. Certainly knew his stuff, of that is no doubt whatsoever.